Next, we're going to hear from Steve Goodman, which is really good at this late hour in the afternoon because Steve always wakes us up, I know, at our Annals meeting when we hear his booming voice coming from across the country over the phone. So for those of you who don't know Steve, Steve is at Stanford, where he is Associate Dean of Clinical Research, Chief of Epidemiology, and because that's not enough, also co-director of the Metrics group, which stands for Meta Research Innovation Center. He's also the vice chair of the PCORI Methodology Committee, very relevant to the presentation we just heard, but most relevant to me, and I think to the topic of this presentation, is that Steve is marking his 30th year as a statistical editor at the Annals of Internal Medicine, where I'm currently editor-in-chief. He apparently started when he was in kindergarten, I think. So without any further delay, let's hear Steve's going to tell us how to get SMARTA, which is something I think we all probably want to do.
Oh, that's the light. That doesn't work. Oh, there we go. Okay. Doesn't do any good to talk into a light. So we are going to talk about statistical review in biomedical journals. I appreciate fantastically that so many of you stayed this long. I expected to see the Hurricane Irma effect of, where this ocean receded, right before it came in, and all of a sudden, area you thought that was covered was bare. So that hasn't happened. So I will tell you ahead of time, this is not a 30-minute talk. In adherence to the principles and spirit and principles of this conference. I'm going to try to make it half that time with the other half for discussion, and therefore there are a lot of things I could say that I won't, which I'm sure will come up in the discussion. My goal in this talk is both to report on the results of some research we've just started, but also to get Howard Bauchner to concede that SMARTA is at least as good an acronym as Yoda. So we'll see if we succeed in that. Well, you don't know. But I'm not going to tell you what it means till the very end, so you have to stay at least that long. So this is work that's been done with two folks. One is Tom Hardwick, one of our new postdocs, and Dan Finelli, our senior scientist. There they are. You're going to see Tom again in this talk, and you will see him around the meeting. So let's just start. What do we know about the use of statistics in the biomedical literature? And the fact is we know a lot. I'm not going to review all that here today. There are many, many, many reviews of the use of statistics, particularly specific techniques, but also generally in various specialties or in various journals, and they all almost universally show the same thing, which is there's widespread misunderstanding, misreporting, misapplication, misuse, miscalculation, and misinterpretation of statistics in the biomedical literature. That is the subject of a very long talk, a very fun talk, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. But I won't resist showing at least one of the reasons for it. So this is a paper done at the home base of Yoda, I will say. And it's one of an industry of such papers in which medical residents are who become the investigators, and they're the readers of the journals, are assessed as far as their own statistical knowledge. I actually think there should be a law against this. I mean, we can't experiment on medical students or prisoners. Why should we be able to do this to our residents? And I also don't understand the motivation. Well, why is it, how is it in our interest to show that our own trainees actually don't know something that we're supposed to be teaching them? But anyway, the point of this is actually not what they did or didn't know. They didn't perform very well, but they never do in these papers. But there was a certain irony here in that while 59% of the surveyed residents were reportedly chose the correct p-value definition, but none of the definitions in the questionnaire were correct. And this was in the supplemental materials if you wanted to go look. There were no correct answers that they were offered. So that says something about the use of statistics. Now, with p-values, maybe that is forgivable because, as 538 has shown us in a little video that you should all look for if you haven't seen it yet, not even scientists can easily explain p-values, and this is the reaction of about 10 different people who were asked, including many people in the room, to explain what a p-value is. So, that definition is perhaps excusable, but the point is that there are a lot of basic principles that are not understood by the very people who are doing the research and reading the research. And this is one of the elephants in the room, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But what do we know about the use and effect of statistical review in the medical literature? So we know a lot about misuse of statistics. This is one of those remedies. And the fact is, we don't know a lot. There are a few before-after studies. There's actually one RCT out there at medical clinics of Barcelona. I'm completely conflicted on that because it turns out that they use something they called the Goodman scale. I never created something I called that, but they used a scale we used at Annals of Internal Medicine once to assess the effect of editing in general, and they showed a small effect. There was another before-after study in the Croatian Medical Journal that showed that it had very little effect because basically the editor ignored the comments of the statistical editor. There are a few articles describing statistical review processes at individual journals like Lancet, New England Journal, and Annals, and of course we had two abstracts here today, one from the Annals and one from the American Veterinary Association Journal. The Annals one showed that even though folks had to work, conceded that they worked incredibly hard to address comments, that they weren't that unhappy about it. Now, this was all authors whose papers were being accepted, by the way, but they thought it was worth the effort. At the Veterinary Journal, unfortunately, they experimented with the process and they abandoned it because the logistics were just too tough, and it extended the review process too long. So there have been a few surveys of the use of statistical review, and that's actually what I'm going to be talking more about today. One by Stephen George in 1985, then another one by myself and him and Doug Altman. I think that we presented at one of these congresses in 1998, and now another one that we've just initiated that I'll talk about today. But I do want to talk a little bit, just mention some of the literature on statistical reviewing. One of the best papers still, this is about 20 years old, is from Doug Altman, which is an amazingly thorough discussion of all the issues and compendium of, at that time, the assessments of of articles in the medical literature. And he has a particular quote that I enjoyed, which is, the difference between medical research and agricultural research is that medical research is done by doctors, but agricultural research is not done by farmers. And it's amusing, maybe a little bit insulting, but it addresses what's really, in a sense, the elephant in the room of many of the things that we're talking about, which is that the research is being done by many folks who are not trained in research. Or if they've been trained in research, they've had very little training. They have not had the years of training of others, and sometimes typically those who get PhDs to do research. And this is I would submit that this is one of the reasons that we're struggling with many of the issues that we're struggling with. And you can't substitute training in research or training in statistics with checklists or better review or different scales or anything. Those are important. Those are critical, but the heart of scientists is done by well-trained scientists. And this gets at the point that most people who do this research are not trained in statistics, although increasingly, certainly over the last 20 years, they have access to very powerful statistical software. Now, the very first, one of the very first, I don't know if it's literally the first, articles on the statistical review, it was done in JAMA in 1964. So this is over 50 years ago, and I'm just going to read you 2 paragraphs from this because they're unbelievably prescient. And they're almost as true today as they were then. So the first one is actually the last of 5 reasons why he said that statistical research was important. Statistical review. He says, 5th, since with the introduction of computers, you can tell how long ago this was, with the introduction of computers, much work is being done to make the results of studies appearing in medical journals more accessible to physicians, so a considerable amount of misinformation could be disseminated rapidly. How different is it today? And then in the next paragraph, he said, in September '64, the editor of one leading medical journal agreed to institute a statistical evaluating procedure for manuscripts submitted for publication. Communications judged acceptable medically were subjected to the same type of critical reading as was used on the studies described in the first part of this report. And he goes on to describe the outcome of this procedure. And as you well know, many journals still do not institute a procedure like this. But let's fast forward to the project that we're actually going to be talking about. And this is a survey that we've been initiated to, in a sense, extend and expand the survey from a number of years ago, which is a survey of the use of the statistical review and statistical review processes across biomedicine and psychology. So what we did is we took the top 5 impact factor journals from all scientific fields within biomedicine, which is 68, and 14 in psychology, which turned out to be 441 journals. And we did this just in the nick of time for the Peer Review Congress. Thank you for scheduling it at this time. And we have 103 journals responding at this time, so you're going to get the interim results, as we talked about yesterday, of 82 biomedical, 21 psychology journals, and representing 56 unique fields. So some of you in this audience actually may have been solicited for this review, and if you're in the 300, 20 that have not yet responded, you've already gotten this reminder from a very friendly Tom Hardwick. It's a very polite reminder, and I'll just request that you avoid reminder number 2, because that's going to be sent by this guy. It won't be nearly as polite, but if you send it in, then you'll get a smiling Tom and a very friendly thank you. So we'll very much appreciate not having to deliver it with the first representative of our project. So here are the results. So the first question we ask is, what percentage of published articles, this is of published articles, have been statistically reviewed? This is a dot plot. And what you'll see is quite a range. And 27%, since there's 103 journals, 27 journals, say that they have reviewed all of them. And by statistical review, this is what we have in the question. We mean any technical assessment of the presentation and analysis of quantitative information that is performed in addition to traditional subject matter peer review. So that's how we defined it, or that's what we said. So 27% said all of them. 35% review 10% or less of the published articles. Some number of those journals said that they don't publish articles that are suitable for statistical review, so they might have been reviewed journals. We have to actually look at those. And the median is 30%. So of this sample so far, a median of 30% of the articles have been statistically reviewed. So then we asked, among those who actually used 10% or more, we didn't pursue it further for those who didn't review very much, a series of questions. So here's the answers. At what stage is it solicited? And you see that about 70%, 80% is either after peer review or, that about half is at the same time as regular peer review, which is interesting. And the other half is after regular peer review or after provisional acceptance. How are they chosen? About 25 of 68, so that's about 40% are part of the editorial team, and about another 30% are in a pool of external experts. We asked how big that pool was, and one journal really messed us up with saying it had 200 people in its pool. But you will see that the mode is 1 down at the bottom. So the vast majority of journals had 1. The median actually turns out to be 4. So that could be 4 in the team or 4 external, but quite a number of journals use just 1 consultant. Are they paid? About half are not paid, and about half are paid either on a retainer basis or per review. Then we asked, are they given any sort of guidelines for their review? And we asked if they gave them sort of optional guidelines for them to follow, or a template that they were required to fill out. 35 of the 68, so about half, gave them nothing, neither. A few gave them suggested guidelines. Almost none gave them anything required. So a vast majority are sort of on their own. Does the statistical reviewer see a revised manuscript? And about 80% said usually or almost always. That's pretty good. How often, and this is a perception, how often does statistical review result in an important change in the manuscript? And these were, by the way, I should say almost all the respondents were the editors-in-chief. So these are the perceptions of the editor-in-chief. 75% said, yes, important, with a fair number, obviously half above that, some below. How do you rate the incremental importance? So this was incremental over what they get out of the peer reviewers and the other editors. So the red and yellow, red is extremely important, yellow is very important. So the accuracy and completeness of the statistical methods description, so they vary, that's about 85%. They rely on the statistical reviewers for this. Strength of the study design, interesting, a little bit less, extremely and very important, although still about 80% of the sample. Appropriateness of the statistical procedures, that's on the bottom, that's almost universal, that they relied on for that. The correctness of the calculations, still highly dependent on that, but not quite as much as the appropriateness. Presentations of the quantitative results, you can see about a quarter, very important, about a half, a quarter extremely important, and a half very important. And consistency of the results reported in the manuscript tables, figures, and abstracts, you see actually a lot more here, or just in the moderately important category, although still dominated by very and extremely. I think this is because they think this can be done by a lot of, by other less qualified folks to look at the numbers the same. Interestingly, when we get to the adequacy of reporting study limitations, the importance of the statistical reviewer is a bit less. That's probably about 40% total there. But interpretations, the quantitative results, again, the vast majority extremely or very important. And then how do you rate the incremental value in evaluating the consistency of the conclusions with the strength of the evidence? Again, fair number in the extremely important, about half, 40% in the very important, and then about a third in the moderately important. Then we looked at what affects their decision to use statistical review. I was actually surprised by these results a lot. In the light blue, it's not at all important. And in the slightly darker blue, it's slightly important. So those two bars that I've now highlighted are basically, it's unimportant. And for the majority of respondents, the increase in reviewing time was not much of a factor. I was surprised by that. Although we actually asked them how long their reviews were delayed, and the vast majority were less than 2 weeks, with about half being 0 delay. The cost, I was actually then also surprised. The vast majority, about 85%, said this is not at all important. So either they weren't paying the reviewers, or the pay was negligible enough so they didn't care about it. I don't know which one. Or the reviewers were not demanding what they were worth. Then finally, difficulty in identifying statistical reviewers. Here we have about 40% of the sample saying it was important. The others seem to have what they needed. And then finally, uncertainty about added benefit. And there's an interesting discontinuity here. Here, about 90%, this is not the issue. They are not uncertain about the added benefit. That is, they do think it has significant benefit. But if they don't use them, it's for these other reasons. So this brings us to SMARTA. SMARTA is an acronym for Statisticians and Methodologists for Advising, Reviewing, and Technical Assistance. I'm waiting to hear from Howard. I'm not hearing anything yet. He's brewing over it. So what is SMARTA? So SMARTA is a large pool of high-quality methodologists that we're putting together to review biomedical journal articles, first for scientific purposes, and then perhaps depending on what we find, as a pool available to the biomedical journal community. It's a collaboration with the American Statistical Association, the International Biometric Society, the U.S. Biostat chairs, and several European statistical societies. Our goal is to use this to a smaller group, maybe on the order of 50, to do 2 projects. First, a large-scale, vertically integrated, and by that I mean actually reading every part of the manuscript and all of the statistics and all of the results, and not just looking at one method or one section. Reading the whole paper is a holistic assessment of the current use of statistics in the biomedical literature and its integration with design and claims. This is going to be a lot of work. And one of several questions we'll be asking, is it different in journals that use different kinds of statistical review? Won't be the only question. Second is that we'll then go from that phase, which will provide the baseline, to use this same team to evaluate different models of statistical review in the biomedical literature. And this is important because the idea of having a statistical consultant available with the time it takes for even if it's just one, for every biomedical journal, it probably outstrips the number of the capacity of the statisticians in the world. Who have the time to do this. So we'll be looking at the effectiveness of different models, the scalability of models, and the sustainability of models, both in terms of personnel and in terms of cost. And then, depending on what we find, and this will occur hopefully over the next few years, we might then proceed to making this group available. I will say that we started this with money, that we then lost the money, and then it looks like we might get back the money. So until I know that absolutely for sure, I can't promise all of this will happen, but it looks probable. I want to finish up with a quote from that 98 paper from Doug, and it's really wonderful. And this is the end of his article. He says, "I would summarize reviewing medical papers as difficult, time-consuming, sometimes interesting, sometimes boring, appreciated by journals, appreciated by authors, but perhaps not appreciated by employers, usually unpaid, occasionally frustrating, and educational. Many journals are desperate for expert statistical help. I recommend statisticians try it." Thank you, Doug, and thank you all for hanging in there.
So we'll open it up to questions or to Howard's vote on the acronyms. You left them speechless, Steve.
Wow.
Well, so Annals has been doing this 2-stage process for maybe not in the current form for 30 years, and we've actually gotten to more complicated with a team of statisticians talking about the papers. So the most surprising thing that I found in this survey, and full disclosure, I was one of the subjects, was that it didn't extend the time of the review, and it may be because it looked like the majority of the journals were doing the review coincident with the external peer review, which we don't do. So I wonder what your perception.
We're going to have to do more analysis to figure that out. We haven't done all the crosstabs that we want to do and the size of these journals. We also ask things like how many articles do you publish in a year? That's going to have a lot to do with it. So I was surprised, and we'll also want to look at the crosstab of whether whether the ones that have the least delay are the ones that send it out at the same time as peer review. It's difficult to know how they could send it out at the same time as peer review, because that means they're getting statistical review on a lot of papers that they're not going to publish. So that's a very inefficient use of their resource. Yeah. So we need to dig into this more to figure that out, but it was clear that, that at least the models that were being used, and I don't think there are very, very few journals that use the kind of processes that the Annals or the BMJ or the New England Journal or some of the top journals use, which is obviously a very involved process. So we'll have to look into that further and see what it is they're doing.
So let's take some questions. I think Kay was the first one up at the mic, so we'll start with you.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
As you know, we're doing something that's a little different with ophthalmology and optometry journals, where experts in systematic reviews are the editors for those papers. So one of the comments we've gotten back more than one of the comments we've gotten back from peer reviewers about this work, which is funded by the NIH, is don't you want to measure whether the quality of the papers will improve? And based on your work at this Congress, maybe 20 years ago, with Annals,
Yep.
I just wasn't sure how to measure quality improvement. Do you have, and what you showed us was the opinion of the editors, but what about
Right.
quality improvement of the papers?
Well, that's actually the second project that I said we were going to do. I don't know that we will assess overall quality, but we'll develop a metric having to do with a lot of aspects related to, first of all, there are things that you can measure in terms of use of statistics that are clearly right and wrong. So there's a lot there. When you start talking about whether the tone of the conclusions is consistent with the strength of evidence, then you're getting into far more subjective territory. So I think it's going to be a mix of subjective assessments, which I think we still have to make, and things that actually do pretty much have a clear right and wrong. So I don't know that we're going to be addressing all the dimensions of quality of the manuscripts. I think we're going to be assessing those dimensions of quality that are most closely and most plausibly related to statistical review. But it's, of course, the heart and soul of the problem here.
Okay, let's go to the microphone in the back on this side.
Adrian Barnett, statistician. I love the holistic study. One variable you might want to collect is the sample size, because in my experience, the big data revolution or the big data bandwagon, depending on your perspective, big data is just bigger problems. And these big studies just have a lot more statistical concerns.
So I'm sorry, you're saying the sample size in what project, in which?
In the holistic study where you look through and look for problems.
Oh, yeah.
My suspicion is there'll be more problems in the big data studies.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we'll look at that and invite you to be part of it.
Okay, microphone in the back on this side.
Yes. Hi, Eric Turner with Oregon Health and Science University. I was wondering if you'd thought about maybe applying this to the register reports model, which for those of who aren't familiar with it is a two-stage review, a pre-study review based on the methods, so there's not a biasing effect of knowing the results, whether the results are significant, and then a later review after the study is completed in the traditional manner. So I'm wondering how that might particularly be relevant to a statistical review, whereas oftentimes a statistician, as I understand it, is not even approached until the horse is out of the barn, the study's done, and then basically the statistician is doing damage control, trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
Right. So actually, it's interesting you mentioned that, since Tom Hardwick, who's working on this project, has been very involved in the registered reports effort as well. We honestly hadn't thought about that because we hadn't thought about using this as a part of the process of improving the science itself earlier on. It's an interesting idea, and we're looking for creative ideas. So that's something we may take on going forward. Well, one thing I do want to say in general, if there are folks here who would want to be involved in this, please contact me, because this is sort of a prime ground for finding statisticians, creative statisticians who'd be a great asset.
Okay, we have 4 more minutes for questions. Doug?
Yeah, thank you, Doug Altman. Thanks for your comments, Steve. Firstly, a comment. When journals send only those papers they think need statistical review, they often make the mistake of thinking the more statistics in a paper, the more likely it is to need review, but actually often it's the papers with very little statistics.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
Yeah, okay. The other point I wanted to make was that I think most statisticians would agree that the study design and the data quality are fundamentally important, and you didn't really talk much about that. It was more about analysis and interpretation, but quite often we would strongly recommend rejecting a paper because the design was either inappropriate or poorly executed.
Well, the assessment, so you notice that we did ask for the editor's evaluation of the assessment of the design. So that's certainly going to be something that we're going to want to look for in the project going forward. So I totally agree with you. That said, it will be, we'll only be looking, I think, at published papers. So it will be already papers who've gone through that filter or gone down the hierarchy of journals.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. This mic?
Hello, I'm Chris Graff. I work at Wiley, the publisher, and I volunteer at COPE. And my question is, do you think that it might be possible to recruit machines and to teach them how to help the humans that are involved in statistical review?
So I'm getting old. There already are some software tools to catch some of the things that we've talked about here. I personally doubt whether what I think is the heart and soul of statistical good review, which is uniting the numbers and sense and the science, can be automated. But I do think it's a fair question to ask what aspects of this process can be automated, for which then the statistician or methodologist just provides added value. And I do think we're going there. I don't know how much, and I don't know how powerful the tools can get. But there's a lot of this, I think, that creative, energetic young people could do to take the burden and time. This is what I mean by creating scalable and sustainable models off of the basic housekeeping and using the methodologists for really the higher level stuff, which I doubt. But they never thought a computer could win at Go or chess. So but that's still a constrained universe there. So I don't know where it's going, and I think we need to be talking to the folks who are doing that sort of work and looking carefully at the sort of tools that are coming out, because there's no question that they're going to play somewhat of a role here.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we're out of time for questions, and I am under orders from Annette Flanagan, so I'm going to stop on time. Just a couple of housekeeping items. So immediately after this session is the 8th annual Equator session. Tomorrow, the meeting starts again at 8 a.m. Breakfast will be served at 7. And then following the closing session tomorrow, there will be the peer review week session on transparency and peer review, and that starts at 5:30. So thank you, everyone, and stay around for the Equator lecture.